First reading this morning is from Acts. But filled with the Holy Spirit, Stephen gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. "Look," he said, "I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." But they covered their ears, and with a loud shout, all rushed together against him. Then they dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. And the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning Stephen, he prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then he knelt down and cried out in a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." When he had said that, he died. The word of the Lord.
Famous last words. They are the last words that famous people say just before they die, or perhaps the words themselves are famous because they were uttered by somebody right as they were dying. The famous last words that we maybe remember are important because they can often show us what somebody values, who somebody values, what it is that person is all about. And that's why the last words are often remembered. Now, of course, sometimes famous last words are kind of legendary, and we're not sure that people exactly said them like that, but there are a lot of interesting famous last words out there. And if you Google famous last words, you find a lot of interesting stuff. Here are several. Composer Jean-Philippe Rameau objected to a song being sung at his bedside. He said, "What the devil do you mean to sing to me, priest? You are out of tune." Nostradamus predicted, "Tomorrow at sunrise, I shall no longer be here." He was right. And Johnny Ace, an R&B singer, died in 1954 while playing with a pistol during a break in his concert set. His last words were, "I'll show you that it won't shoot." Those are some of the last words that I remember when people say stuff like that. But you know, sometimes it's the famous last words that are remembered most about a person. And that's actually the case in today's first reading. Today's first reading from Acts is about Stephen, the deacon, being martyred, and the famous last words that he utters. Because the thing is, we actually don't know a lot about Stephen. All that we really know is that there was a dispute going on in the congregation, the early congregation of Christians in Jerusalem, and the problem was apparently that it was already kind of a mixed congregation of Gentiles and Jews, and the Gentile widows were complaining that they weren't getting their share of food like the Jewish widows were getting, and the apostles said, "You know what, we got our hands tied, or we got our hands full already with preaching and teaching and all this stuff." So they set up what at Prince of Peace we would call a care team. People that were supposed to take care of making sure that people in the community had their needs met. So they appointed 7 people, and they called them deacons, and Stephen was one of them, and they were supposed to make sure that people who were hungry in the community got food and got taken care of if they were sick and stuff like that. Thing is, we never hear anything that Stephen does as a deacon. We never hear about him taking food to somebody. We never hear about him taking care of somebody who's ill. All we hear about is how he talks to people about Jesus, and this gets him in trouble. So they drag him before the high priest, who asks him what it is that he's doing, talking about this guy Jesus, and what it is he's saying. And Stephen starts to preach a sermon. And the very last words of that sermon are the beginning of today's first reading. And this sermon so ticks people off that they drag him out of the city and they stone him to death. That's cold. I mean, I've had bad sermons, but you guys have never dragged me out of the church and tried to stone me or anything. But that's really all we know about Stephen, except for his last words. I mean, if he had just been a regular kind of Christian martyr who died giving witness to Jesus, he might not have been that memorable, except that he utters these famous last words. "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." Lord, do not hold this sin against them, the very people who are trying to kill me, who are killing me. I got to tell you that if it happened to this Stephen, probably those would not be my last words. I would be asking God to help me, to save me, to get those people who are trying to kill me. I would come up with some really good words like these. Repay them according to their work and according to the evil of their deeds. Repay them according to the work of their hands. Render them their due reward. That's Psalm 28, by the way. There's lots of great stuff in the Bible where people say to God, listen, God, this horrible thing's happened to me. Save me. Punish those guys. You, God, have vengeance. You wreak vengeance on these people. But that's not what Stephen, the deacon, does. His last words, in fact, reflect some of Jesus' last words. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. In fact, Stephen is probably remembered, and this story was written down because the community, the early Christian community, wanted to remember Stephen's last words. And the last words, as meant the last words of many others, showed what Stephen believed and what he valued. And they became important to the early Christian community to remember, because not only were they unusual and different from what so many of us would say if we were in that situation, but because Stephen's last words served to lift up Jesus. They lifted up Jesus by proclaiming forgiveness over vengeance. Because it's one thing to talk about forgiveness as a great, wonderful virtue. It's wonderful that people forgive and others, especially if you forgive me. That's a really great thing. It's another thing to actually have to live forgiveness in your life when people are being miserable to you. Stephen, by his last words, is asking for God's love and forgiveness on the very people who are killing him, because somehow Stephen values them, those people who are killing him, that they should have a living and life-giving relationship with Jesus, even those people who are trying to kill him. And that lifting up of forgiveness over vengeance ends up lifting up Jesus in a way that he couldn't if he was just going to ask for vengeance. Stephen's last words lift up Jesus by proclaiming confidence in God's future. So the story says that Stephen had this vision of Jesus, standing at the right hand of God, and that can mean that he saw an actual vision of Jesus standing there, but I think it also meant that he had a vision in his life of God's presence in such a way that he was certain that God's will, in the end, was going to win out, even if he himself ended up suffering and dying in the midst of it. God was still going to win, and that kind of confidence, even in the midst of his own death, lifted up Jesus. And maybe most importantly, Stephen's last words lifted up Jesus by showing his willingness to continue to live as a follower of Jesus, even when he was dying, even as he knew that he was going to die, in a society that absolutely rejected him because of his faith. One of the things that's really important when we read stories like this is to remember that there is no follower of Jesus in the New Testament era who ever thought, it was completely inconceivable to them, that Christianity would ever be a thing. That there would ever be lots and lots of people who were going to be Christians. They figured they were going to be a tiny little minority because Jesus was coming back pretty soon, and they were going to be 0.1% and 0.1% and 0.1% of the population before Jesus ever came back. So they never thought that they could convert the whole world, or that they could somehow force other people to believe what they believed, but they were going to live the way they were going to live anyway as Jesus' followers, because they were absolutely confident that God had a plan for them. God had a mission for them, even if they ended up dying in the midst of it. And they knew that that plan involved somehow giving people a foretaste of God's coming kingdom. And they were convinced that was what they needed to do, even if people were continuing to stone him to death. Those things lifted up Jesus, and in the end, those last words are important not because they're final words, but because they lift up the ways and the values that we should also have when we try to follow Jesus, when we try to show Jesus to the world. That's why these words were important to the early Christian community, and it's also why it's important for us to remember them as well. Because for us too right now, living as followers of Jesus often means, and often is best done, when we openly demonstrate forgiveness in our lives. Our world, as it's always been, has been filled with great stories about how people get even with folks who have wronged them. We love those stories. I love those stories. Because in some respects it means that people who are wrongly hurt, persecuted, have finally been vindicated, and it feels really good. There are lots of stories like that in the world, but for people to actually say, you know what, I am going to somehow in my life, even in small ways, I'm going to end the fight. I'm not going to continue it. I'm going to put it all down, and I'm going to live forgiveness in somebody else's life. That ends up showing Jesus to the world in a way that our righteous indignation never can. It was what Stephen realized the best way to show Jesus was, and often that's the best way for us to show Jesus as well. For us too, living as Jesus' disciples and showing Jesus to the world is often best done by expressing confidence in God's future, even and especially when we can't control what today or tomorrow brings. And for us too, I think that's about having vision. Not particularly a vision in the sky of, seeing Jesus necessarily sitting in the clouds, but a vision of God's transcendent presence, that God's purpose and God's love in our lives transcends all the mess that's going on around us, all the confusion, all the chaos, that finally all the stuff we deal with in our everyday lives is not going to have the final word. That kind of vision empowers people to live in new ways. Not just Stephen, but all of us as well. And for us too, when we can live with that kind of confidence that God's love is going to win out in the end, it doesn't mean that everything's going to all be okay. Because like with Stephen, a lot of things are going to it's going to be bad. And people are going to get hurt and people are going to die. But in the end, if we have that confidence that God's will is going to win out, that shows Jesus to the world in a way that all of our great plans for human betterment and the betterment of society never can. And I think also for us, maybe this is most important for us too, the best way to show Jesus to the world is by being willing to continue to call ourselves followers of Jesus and live as followers of Jesus, even when it's no longer popular in the culture. Because most of us have lived, and our families have lived for 1,500 years in the West, where Christianity is just part of the establishment. And people know what a Christian is. Have a friend who's a Baha'i. What does that mean? People don't know. But everybody knows in theory what a Christian is. And a lot of times, Christians are now sort of freaked out. Well, how can we be Christians? How can we continue to have Christian community when we're not the major players in society anymore? When we don't control the government, when we don't control the morality, when we don't... Christianity turned into control and influence. And when that happens, Christians often start to get a little freaked out. And that's when we need to remember that some of the best witness that Christians ever made were in the times when they couldn't believe that Christians would ever be a majority any place, that Christians would ever have control, that Christians were never going to be people who were going to force other people to live according to their standards, or even convince the whole world. I mean, Christians always knew. Jesus says, go and preach the gospel to all nations. But he never said, and they're all going to believe and they're all going to convert. He just said, make sure that everybody knows that everybody is invited and everybody is included. Jesus called people to live in a new way. But he said, you may not be the main dish. You're going to be the salt. A little bit. And the light. And it's when people are willing to do those kinds of things that we show Jesus to the world in ways that powerful and coercive Christianity never can. So these last words, in fact, all last words, can be kind of important because they show people what we really believe and what we really value. But so can the words and the deeds and the attitudes which we live every single day. Those words and deeds and attitudes are ultimately the things which show Jesus to the world. And it may be that someday your last words and mine may have a profound impact on people we're close to and that we care about. But in the end, the most important last words are, in a sense, the last words that God speaks. And the last word that God speaks is a word that's actually already been spoken. it was God's word of resurrection and new life, even in the face of death and despair.